Every parent's worst nightmare is watching their child go hungry with nowhere to call home. Greg Morrison knew this pain all too well as he sat on a park bench, holding his 8-year-old daughter Lucy close, while she asked why they couldn't go back to their house. The cruel landlord had thrown them out that morning, and with his pride keeping him from calling his estranged parents, Greg had nothing left but a cardboard box of his grandfather's old belongings. Lucy, trying to comfort her father, began looking through the box of yellowed photographs and letters. That's when she found it, a small, ornate key taped inside an old envelope with a note written in grandfather's handwriting. The message was simple but mysterious, for when the family needs it most. What Greg discovered next would unlock a secret worth $100 million, hidden for decades. But would this fortune save his fractured family, or would it create new problems that money couldn't solve? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind carried the scent of dying leaves and broken dreams as Greg Morrison adjusted his worn jacket around Lucy's small shoulders. The park bench had become their temporary refuge, but the metal slats were already growing cold beneath them. 3 hours had passed since Mr. Berkowitz, their landlord, had stood in their doorway with that satisfied smirk, watching as the sheriff's deputy supervised their eviction. "Daddy, my tummy hurts," Lucy whispered, pressing closer to her father's side. Her blonde hair, so much like her mother's, caught the afternoon sunlight that filtered through the maple trees above them. Greg's chest tightened. He'd given her the last granola bar from their emergency stash 2 hours ago, and dinner seemed like an impossible luxury now. His checking account held exactly $47.32, barely enough for a cheap motel room, certainly not enough to secure a new apartment with first month's rent and deposits. "I know, sweetheart. We'll figure something out soon," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. This wasn't how Greg had imagined his life would unfold when he'd held Lucy as a newborn 8 years ago. Back then, he'd been a promising junior accountant at Henderson B. Associates, married to the love of his life, Sarah, with dreams of providing the stable, loving home he'd never quite had growing up. The small house they'd rented on Maple Street had seemed perfect 2 bedrooms, a little garden where Sarah could grow her tomatoes, and a tire swing hanging from the old oak tree in the backyard. But cancer had a way of destroying more than just bodies. It devoured savings accounts, college funds, and carefully laid plans. Sarah's medical bills had consumed their emergency fund first, then their credit, and finally their hope. Even with insurance, the experimental treatments and specialists had cost more than Greg could ever have imagined. He'd liquidated his modest 401ek, sold Sarah's engagement ring, and worked overtime hours until his eyes burned, but it hadn't been enough. Sarah had passed away 2 years ago, leaving behind a broken-hearted husband, a 6-year-old daughter who asked when Mommy was coming home, and medical debt that stretched into 6 figures. Greg had been drowning ever since, taking on freelance bookkeeping work when his grief made full-time employment impossible, always one crisis away from complete financial collapse. The eviction notice had arrived 3 weeks ago, a crisp, legal document that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the mercy it contained. Greg had begged Mr. Berkowitz for more time, explaining about the insurance settlement that was supposedly coming, the potential job with a local firm, anything to buy another month. But Berkowitz, a thin man with cold eyes and expensive suits, had simply shrugged. "Business is business, Morrison. You've got 30 days. Now those 30 days had expired, and here they sat with everything they owned fitting into 2 cardboard boxes and a battered duffel bag. The larger box contained their clothes and Lucy's few remaining toys. Most had been sold over the past year to cover utilities and groceries. The smaller box held Greg's grandfather's belongings, items he'd inherited 5 years ago, but never really examined. There had always seemed to be more pressing concerns than old photographs and yellowed letters. Lucy shifted beside him, her small hand tracing the edges of the grandfather's box. "Tell me about great-grandpa Henry again, Daddy." Greg smiled, despite their circumstances. Henry Morrison had died when Lucy was only 3, but she'd loved the stories about his adventures. Well, he was a very interesting man. He came back from the war and started a small construction company, always wore a tie to work, even when he was covered in dust and cement. "And he made the best pancakes in the whole world," Lucy added, though she was too young to actually remember. That's what everyone said. Greg's throat tightened. He could barely afford bread, let alone the ingredients for pancakes. Opening the box had been Lucy's idea. She'd suggested they look through Great-Grandpa Henry's things to remember happy times. Inside, Greg found the familiar collection of black and white photographs, military medals from World War II, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. But there was something different about looking at these items now, something that caught his attention in a way it never had before. In one photograph from 1952, his grandfather stood beside a gleaming Cadillac, wearing an expensive-looking suit. The man in the picture looked prosperous, confident, and well-dressed in a way that didn't match Greg's memories of the modest, hard-working grandfather he'd known. Another photo showed Henry at what appeared to be a construction site. But instead of wearing work clothes, he was dressed like an executive, shaking hands with men in expensive suits beside a sign that read, "Morrison Development Company." "Daddy, what's this?" Lucy held up a small envelope that had been tucked beneath the photographs. Her name was written on it in Henry's distinctive handwriting, "For Lucy Morrison, when she needs it most." Greg's hands trembled as he took the envelope. Inside was the ornate key they'd discovered earlier, along with a brief note. "My dearest great-granddaughter, if you're reading this, it means your father has found himself in difficult circumstances. This key will unlock what I've saved for our family's future. Trust no one else with this secret until you're certain of their intentions. All my love, Great-Grandpa Henry." The key was unlike anything Greg had ever seen, heavy, made of what appeared to be real gold, with intricate engravings along its length. It looked old, expensive, and completely out of place among his grandfather's modest possessions. A small tag attached to it bore the inscription FNB 1947 HDM. "What does it open, Daddy?" Greg studied the key, his accountant's mind racing through possibilities. FNB likely stood for First National Bank. The year 1947 made sense. That would have been just after the war, when his grandfather was establishing his business. But HDM Henry David Morrison suggested this was something significant, something his grandfather had specifically set aside. "I'm not sure yet, sweetheart, but maybe it's something that can help us." Lucy leaned against him, her small body warm and trusting. Great-Grandpa Henry was smart, wasn't he? Maybe he knew we'd need help someday. The innocence in her voice broke Greg's heart. At 8 years old, she shouldn't have to worry about where they'd sleep tonight or when they'd eat their next meal. She should be thinking about homework and playground games and what costume she wanted for Halloween. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Greg made a decision. Tomorrow, he would take the key to First National Bank. He would swallow his pride and see if his grandfather had indeed left something that could help them. It was probably nothing, maybe an old safety deposit box with more photographs and sentimental items. But it was the only lead they had, the only hope in a situation that seemed utterly hopeless. "Come on, Lucy, let's go find somewhere warm to spend the night." She slipped her hand into his, trusting and brave. "Will we have a real home again soon, Daddy?" Greg squeezed her hand, looking down at the key that gleamed in the fading daylight. "I hope so, sweetheart. I really hope so." As they walked toward the park's exit, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that his grandfather's voice was somehow reaching across the years, offering guidance when they needed it most. The key felt warm in his pocket, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that tomorrow might bring something better than despair. The next morning found Greg and Lucy at the Sunrise Diner, a 24-hour establishment where the coffee was strong and the waitresses didn't ask too many questions about customers who looked like they'd spent the night in their car. Greg had managed to secure them a room at the roadside motel for $35, leaving their finances even more precarious, but Lucy had slept soundly on clean sheets, and that was worth every penny. Now, as she colored on the back of a paper placemat with crayons borrowed from the hostess station, Greg examined the ornate key in the morning light streaming through the diner's windows. The engravings were even more intricate than he'd noticed the night before, tiny flourishes and symbols that spoke of craftsmanship from an earlier era. The weight of it suggested real gold, which seemed impossible given his grandfather's modest lifestyle. "Daddy, look what I drew," Lucy said, sliding her placemat across the table. She'd sketched their little family herself, Greg, and a woman with flowing hair who could only be her mother. Above them, she'd drawn an elderly man with a kind smile, watching over them all. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. Is that great-grandpa Henry?" I think he's helping us from heaven." She pointed to something in the drawing that Greg hadn't noticed at first, a small key in the grandfather figure's hand, glowing with yellow crayon marks. Greg's chest tightened with emotion. Even at 8, Lucy seemed to understand something profound about their situation, something that his adult mind struggled to accept. Maybe there were forces at work beyond his comprehension. Maybe his grandfather's love truly had transcended death to provide for them when they needed it most. The bell above the diner's door chimed, and Greg looked up to see Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian from the local historical society. She was a fixture in their small town, a woman who dedicated her life to preserving local history and helping residents trace their family roots. Her silver hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, and she wore a thick cardigan against the October chill. "Greg Morrison, isn't it?" She approached their table with a warm smile. "I heard about your difficulties. I'm so sorry, dear." Greg felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. In a town of 12,000 people, news traveled fast, especially bad news. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. We're managing." She glanced at Lucy, who looked up from her coloring with bright, curious eyes. "And this must be Lucy. My goodness, you look just like your great-grandfather when he was young." "You knew great-grandpa Henry?" Lucy asked. Her crayon paused mid-stroke. "Oh my, yes. Henry Morrison was quite a character in this town. Very generous man, always helping families in need." Mrs. Henderson's eyes fell on the key lying beside Greg's coffee cup. Her expression changed immediately, her eyebrows rising in surprise. "My word? Is that what I think it is?" Greg followed her gaze. "You recognize this key?" Mrs. Henderson pulled out the chair beside Lucy and sat down, her attention entirely focused on the ornate object. "May I?" When Greg nodded, she picked up the key with reverent hands, examining the engravings with the practiced eye of a historian. "This is a safety deposit box key from the 1940s, she said finally. "See these markings here? FNB stands for First National Bank, and this style of engraving was only used for their most exclusive accounts. Your grandfather must have been quite wealthy to afford one of these." Greg shook his head. "That's impossible. My grandfather was a construction worker. He lived in a small house on Elm Street, drove an old pickup truck. He wasn't wealthy." Mrs. Henderson's smile was knowing, the expression of someone who'd spent decades uncovering family secrets through dusty records and forgotten documents. "Oh, my dear boy, your grandfather was far more than a construction worker. He owned Morrison Development Company, one of the most successful construction firms in the Tri-County area during the 1950s and 60s. He built half the commercial district downtown." The diner seemed to spin around Greg. "That's not possible. I would have known. My family would have told me. Family secrets have a way of persisting," Mrs. Henderson said gently. "Especially when there's money involved. People can become quite protective of wealth, even from their own relatives." Lucy looked up from her drawing, her young mind processing the conversation with startling clarity. "Does this mean great-grandpa Henry was rich, Daddy?" Before Greg could answer, Mrs. Henderson continued, "I remember when Henry died 5 years ago. There was quite a stir at the courthouse about his estate. Lots of family members coming and going, lawyers involved. But you know what struck me as odd? I never saw you there, Greg. Not once." The coffee in Greg's stomach turned to acid. "I was dealing with Sarah's medical treatments then. Her cancer had just been diagnosed. I couldn't focus on anything else." "Of course, dear. That explains it." Henderson's voice was sympathetic, but her eyes held a shrewd intelligence. "But it also explains why you might not know about your grandfather's true legacy." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook, writing something down and tearing out the page. "Here's the address for the Historical Society. We have extensive records on Morrison Development Company, including property holdings and business transactions. You should come by this afternoon." Greg took the paper with trembling hands. "Mrs. Henderson, what exactly are you saying?" The elderly woman stood, smoothing down her cardigan. "I'm saying that your grandfather was a very wealthy man who cared deeply about his family's future. That key in your hand isn't just a piece of metal, it's a legacy. The question is whether the rest of your family intended for you to inherit it." After she left, Greg sat in stunned silence, staring at the key while Lucy continued coloring. The implications of Mrs. Henderson's words were staggering. If his grandfather had been wealthy, if there truly was money set aside, then why had his family allowed him to struggle? Why had they let him lose his home, let him and Lucy become homeless, when help might have been available all along? The more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together in disturbing ways. His parents, William and Margaret Morrison, lived in a large house on the wealthy side of town. His father drove a new luxury car every few years. His mother wore expensive jewelry and took frequent trips to visit relatives in other states. They'd always claimed their success came from his father's insurance business, but what if there was another source of income? What if they'd been benefiting from his grandfather's wealth while deliberately keeping Greg in the dark? The memory of his grandfather's funeral came flooding back with new significance. Greg had attended, of course, but he'd been distracted by Sarah's chemotherapy schedule and Lucy's needs as a 3-year-old. He remembered his parents and his Uncle Robert speaking in hushed tones with the lawyer, remembered documents being signed and discussions he wasn't included in. At the time, he'd assumed it was just typical funeral business, organizing the modest estate of a hard-working man. But what if it had been something much more significant? "Daddy, are you okay?" Lucy's voice brought him back to the present. She was looking at him with concern, her small hand reaching across the table to touch his arm. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking." He forced a smile, but his mind was racing. "Lucy, how would you like to take a trip to the library today? We're going to learn more about great-grandpa Henry." Her face lit up. "Can we find more pictures of him?" "Maybe. And maybe we'll find some answers to help us understand that key." As they left the diner, Greg felt a mixture of hope and dread settling in his chest. Hope that his grandfather had indeed provided for their future, and dread at what he might discover about his own family's role in keeping that future from them. The ornate key felt heavier in his pocket now, weighted not just with gold, but with the possibility that everything he thought he knew about his family had been a carefully constructed lie. The October wind whipped around them as they walked toward the Historical Society, and Greg couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking toward a revelation that would change their lives forever, for better or worse. The First National Bank's limestone facade stood imposingly on Main Street, its brass nameplate weathered by decades of Midwest seasons. Greg had driven past this building countless times throughout his life, never imagining he might one day walk through its doors, carrying a key that could change everything. Lucy gripped his hand tightly as they approached the heavy wooden doors. "It looks fancy, Daddy." "It does, doesn't it?" Greg's voice was steadier than his nerves. The morning at the Historical Society had revealed disturbing truths about his grandfather's wealth and his family's possible deception. Now, with bank records from 1947 tucked in his jacket pocket, copies Mrs. Henderson had provided showing substantial deposits made by Morrison Development Company. He was ready to confront whatever lay behind the ornate key. The bank's interior retained its old-world elegance, marble floors, brass fixtures, and teller windows that spoke of an era when banking was a relationship rather than a transaction. A receptionist with graying hair and kind eyes looked up from her desk as they approached. "Good afternoon. How may I help you?" Greg withdrew the key, his hand trembling slightly. "I believe this opens a safety deposit box here. It belonged to my grandfather, Henry Morrison." The woman's eyes widened as she examined the key. "Oh my! We haven't seen one of these in years. Please, have a seat. I'll need to get Mr. Patterson, our senior vice president." While they waited, Lucy explored the small waiting area, fascinated by the old paintings of the town's founding fathers and the antique furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Greg watched her with a mixture of love and worry. Whatever they discovered today would impact her future as much as his own. Mr. Morrison, a distinguished man in his 60s, appeared, extending his hand. "I'm Richard Patterson. I understand you have a key that belonged to your grandfather." Greg stood, shaking the offered hand. "Yes, sir. Henry Morrison. He passed away 5 years ago." Mr. Patterson's expression grew serious. "Please, follow me to my office. What you're carrying represents one of our oldest and most significant accounts." His office was paneled in dark wood, with family photographs and banking awards covering the walls. He gestured for them to sit in the leather chairs, facing his desk, while Lucy quietly examined a snow globe on the side table. "Mr. Morrison, I have to ask, are you aware of the extent of your grandfather's holdings with this institution?" "Until yesterday, I thought my grandfather was a simple construction worker. I'm learning that wasn't entirely true." Mr. Patterson nodded gravely. "Henry Morrison was indeed much more than that. He was one of our most valued clients for over 40 years. He pulled a thick file from his desk drawer. When he established his accounts in 1947, he made very specific instructions about their management. Instructions that, frankly, we've been waiting for someone in your family to inquire about." Greg felt his mouth go dry. "What kind of instructions?" "Your grandfather established multiple safety deposit boxes and investment accounts. The key you're holding accesses the primary box, but there are others. More importantly, there are investment accounts that have been growing for decades, managed according to his detailed specifications." The room seemed to tilt around Greg. "Investment accounts? Conservative investments, primarily blue-chip stocks and government bonds. Your grandfather was quite specific that these accounts were to be managed for maximum long-term growth while preserving capital." Mr. Patterson consulted the file. "The current value of all holdings is approximately 127 million. Lucy looked up from the snow globe. "Daddy, did that man just say a really big number?" Greg couldn't speak. The figure was so astronomical, so beyond anything he could have imagined, that his mind simply refused to process it. $127 million. More money than he'd ever dreamed of, sitting in accounts he'd never known existed, while he and Lucy had been homeless. "I can see this is overwhelming, Mr. Patterson said gently. "Perhaps we should start with the safety deposit box. It contains documents that might help explain your grandfather's intentions." The safety deposit box room was in the bank's basement, a vault-like space with rows of metal boxes lining the walls. Mr. Patterson led them to box number 347, a large container that required both Greg's key and the bank's master key to open. Inside were documents that told the story of a remarkable man's foresight and love for his family. The original incorporation papers for Morrison Development Company showed that Henry had built his construction business into a regional powerhouse, with contracts spanning 3 states. There were real estate deeds for properties Greg had never heard of, stock certificates for shares purchased decades ago in companies that had become household names, and most importantly, detailed letters explaining his intentions. "My dear family," one letter began, written in Henry's careful handwriting, "if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you, and circumstances have led you to discover what I've set aside for your future. I have worked my entire life to ensure that my descendants would never know the poverty and uncertainty that marked my own childhood." Greg's hands shook as he continued reading. The letter went on to explain that Henry had deliberately kept his wealth quiet, fearing it would breed laziness or entitlement in his children. He had provided modestly for their needs, but had reserved the bulk of his fortune for future generations, specifically for Greg's branch of the family tree. "Your father and uncle have received sufficient provision for their lives," Henry had written, "but the true inheritance belongs to you and your children. Use this gift wisely, with gratitude and purpose." "Daddy, what does it say?" Lucy asked, sensing the gravity of the moment. "It says, Great-Grandpa Henry loved us very much, and he wanted to make sure we'd always be okay." Mr. Patterson cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mr. Morrison, I should mention that other family members have inquired about these accounts over the years. Your father and uncle, specifically, they've been aware of the holdings but were told they could not access them without the primary key, the one you're holding." The implications hit Greg like a physical blow. His family had known. They'd known about the money while he struggled to pay for Sarah's medical treatments. They'd known while he worked 3 jobs and sold everything of value. They'd known while he and Lucy became homeless. "How long have they known?" Greg's voice was barely a whisper. "They've been receiving modest distributions from a separate trust your grandfather established for their lifetime care. But they've been asking about the primary inheritance for years, especially after your grandfather's death." Greg closed his eyes, trying to process the betrayal. His parents lived comfortably, not lavishly, but they'd never wanted for anything. They'd watched him struggle and had never offered more than token assistance, claiming their own financial limitations. All while knowing that millions of dollars sat in accounts he couldn't access because he didn't have a key that had been hidden among his grandfather's possessions. "Mr. Patterson, what exactly do I need to do to claim this inheritance? The process is relatively straightforward now that you have the key and can prove your identity. However, I should warn you that accessing these accounts will likely trigger notifications to other family members who have been monitoring them. There may be legal challenges." Greg looked at Lucy, who was quietly examining the old documents with the curiosity of a child who didn't yet understand that their lives had just been transformed. "Let them challenge it. My grandfather left this for us, and we need it." As they prepared to leave the bank, Mr. Patterson handed Greg a business card. "I'll begin the paperwork to transfer account access to you. In the meantime, I can arrange for immediate access to funds if you have pressing needs." Walking out of the bank an hour later, Greg felt like he was floating. In his pocket, along with the ornate key, was a cashier's check for $50,000, just a tiny fraction of his inheritance, but enough to secure housing and stability for Lucy. More importantly, he carried the knowledge that his grandfather's love had reached across the years to provide for them exactly when they needed it most. But he also carried the bitter realization that his own family had betrayed that love, allowing him and Lucy to suffer while protecting their own interests. The money would solve their immediate problems, but the emotional wounds of that betrayal would take much longer to heal. The law office of Mitchell, Associates, occupied the 2nd floor of a restored Victorian building on Courthouse Square. Greg had called ahead, explaining that he needed immediate legal advice regarding a substantial inheritance, and attorney Janet Mitchell had agreed to see him that same afternoon. The land deed from 1949 that he'd discovered in the safety deposit box lay heavy in his briefcase, along with documents that revealed the true scope of his grandfather's legacy. "Daddy, is this where we find out about the other properties?" Lucy asked as they climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. She'd been remarkably adaptable to the day's revelations, accepting their sudden change in fortune with the resilience that children possessed. "That's right, sweetheart. We're going to learn about everything Great-Grandpa Henry left for us." Janet Mitchell was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the confident demeanor of someone who'd spent decades navigating complex legal matters. Her office was filled with law books and family photographs, creating an atmosphere of competence and warmth. "Mr. Morrison, please have a seat. I understand you've had quite a day at the bank." She gestured to the chairs across from her desk, while Lucy settled into a smaller chair with a children's book the receptionist had provided. Greg placed the land deed on her desk. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm starting to realize that my grandfather owned far more than I ever imagined. This deed shows he owned property with mineral rights, but I don't understand the implications." Janet examined the document carefully, her eyebrows rising as she read the legal descriptions and surveyed coordinates. "Mr. Morrison, this is quite significant. Your grandfather owned 17 parcels of land across 3 counties, including mineral rights to oil and natural gas deposits." She pulled out a large map from her filing cabinet and began marking locations. "Several of these properties are currently being leased to energy companies." Leased? Greg felt that familiar sensation of the world shifting beneath his feet. "Yes, let me make some calls." Janet spent the next 20 minutes on the phone with various land management companies and county offices, taking notes and asking detailed questions. When she finished, her expression was a mixture of amazement and concern. "Mr. Morrison, your grandfather was receiving substantial monthly payments from these leases payments that have been accumulating in trust accounts managed by this firm since his death. We've been looking for the rightful heir for 5 years." Greg stared at her. "How substantial?" "The monthly payments average about 180 over 5 years with accrued interest. You're looking at approximately 12 million in accumulated lease payments alone." Lucy looked up from her book. "Daddy, why do all these people keep saying really big numbers?" Janet smiled at Lucy before turning back to Greg. "There's more. Some of these properties have appreciated dramatically in value due to development in the surrounding areas. The property near the new shopping district is now worth about 8 million by itself." Greg slumped in his chair, overwhelmed. Between the bank accounts and these property holdings, he was learning that his grandfather had been worth well over 150 million. The scope of wealth was staggering, but more troubling was the growing realization of how many people had known about it. "Mrs. Mitchell, who else knew about these lease payments?" Her expression grew troubled. "That's where things become complicated. Your grandfather's will named your Uncle Robert as the executor of his estate. Robert has been overseeing the management of these properties and the accumulation of lease payments. He's been receiving detailed quarterly reports." The betrayal cut deeper with each revelation. Uncle Robert had been managing millions of dollars in Greg's inheritance, while Greg struggled to keep a roof over his family's head. Robert, who had always seemed modestly successful with his insurance business, had been sitting on a fortune that belonged to Greg and Lucy. "I need to understand something," Greg said carefully. "Why wasn't I notified about any of this when my grandfather died?" Janet consulted the file on her desk. "According to our records, the executor informed us that you were dealing with family medical issues and didn't want to be bothered with estate matters. He said he would handle everything and contact you when appropriate." Greg felt sick. Sarah had been undergoing chemotherapy, and he'd been consumed with her care and Lucy's needs. When Uncle Robert had offered to handle all the legal stuff related to grandfather's death, Greg had been grateful for one less burden. He'd trusted his family to act in his best interests. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to see all the documents related to my grandfather's will and estate management." Of course, but I should warn you, this situation is going to create significant family conflict. Your uncle has been operating under the assumption that he was protecting these assets until you were in a better position to manage them. Protecting them? Greg's voice rose. My daughter and I were just evicted from our home. We spent last night in a motel room that cost more than we could afford. How is keeping us in poverty protecting anything? Janet's expression was sympathetic but professional. I'm not defending the decisions that were made, just explaining the legal position we're in. However, with the primary key to the safety deposit box and your grandfather's explicit instructions, you have a strong legal claim to immediate access to your inheritance. She pulled out a thick folder containing copies of all estate documents. Your grandfather's will is quite specific. While it names Robert as executor, it clearly states that the bulk of the estate is to go to your bloodline upon your discovery of the inheritance. It's almost as if he anticipated that his wishes might not be followed by the family. Greg studied the will, written in his grandfather's careful handwriting and properly witnessed. The language was clear. To my beloved grandson, Gregory Morrison, and his descendants, I leave the entirety of my business holdings, investment accounts, and real property to be revealed to them when they have need and are ready to receive this gift responsibly. He knew, Greg said quietly. Somehow, he knew that the family wouldn't tell me about this immediately. It appears so. Your grandfather was quite specific that you should inherit when you needed it most, not necessarily immediately upon his death. Lucy approached Greg's chair, sensing his emotional turmoil. Daddy, are you sad? He pulled her onto his lap, holding her close. Not sad, sweetheart. Just understanding some things about our family that I didn't know before. Janet continued explaining the legal situation. The good news is that as the named heir with possession of the primary key, you have immediate legal standing to claim your inheritance. The challenging news is that this will likely result in a significant dispute with your uncle and possibly your parents. What do I need to do? I'll file the necessary paperwork with the probate court to establish your claim and remove Robert as executor. We'll also need to conduct a full audit of all estate assets to ensure everything is accounted for. Given the amounts involved, I'd recommend hiring a forensic accountant. As they prepared to leave the law office, Janet handed Greg a thick packet of documents. Mr. Morrison, I want you to understand what you're facing. Your family has had control over a fortune for 5 years. People don't give up that kind of money easily, even when it was never legally theirs. Walking back to their car, Greg felt the weight of knowledge and responsibility settling on his shoulders. The money would solve every practical problem they faced, but it would also force him to confront the reality that his family had chosen financial gain over his and Lucy's welfare. Daddy, will we have a house soon? Lucy asked as he buckled her into the car seat. Yes, sweetheart. We'll have a beautiful house, and you'll have your own room, and we'll never have to worry about having enough food or a warm place to sleep. But even as he made that promise, Greg wondered what price they would ultimately pay for claiming what was rightfully theirs. The money came with the burden of understanding that those who should have protected them had instead protected themselves, and that knowledge would be harder to bear than any amount of poverty. That evening, in their modest motel room, Greg sat cross-legged on the floor with Lucy as she carefully arranged the love letters from 1945 that they'd found in the deepest corner of the safety deposit box. The correspondence between Henry and his wife Eleanor revealed a side of his grandfather that Greg had never known, a romantic, thoughtful man who'd planned for his family's future with the same care he'd shown in courting his bride. Daddy, great-grandpa Henry wrote really pretty letters, Lucy observed, holding up one of the delicate pages. Though she couldn't read the flowing script, she could sense the love that radiated from every carefully penned word. He did, sweetheart, and they tell us a lot about how he built our family's future. Greg had been reading the letters chronologically, watching his grandparents' relationship unfold against the backdrop of post-war America. But it was the financial details woven throughout the correspondence that truly amazed him. Henry hadn't stumbled into wealth, he'd constructed it methodically, investment by investment, with the precision of a master craftsman. My dearest Eleanor, one letter from December 1947 read, "The government contract for the Veterans Housing Project has been approved. With this success, I've been able to invest in 3 more parcels of land outside town, as well as shares in that new company making television, Zenith Corporation. Every dollar we save and invest now will compound for our children and grandchildren. I want our family to never know the fear of poverty that marked my childhood." Another letter, dated March 1949, revealed even more strategic thinking. The Marshall Plan is creating opportunities for construction companies willing to think beyond local projects. I've partnered with firms in Chicago and Detroit to bid on larger contracts. We're also investing in this new concept called shopping centers, imagine stores all gathered in one place with abundant parking. Mark my words, Eleanor, this will change how Americans shop, and we'll profit from that change. Greg marveled at his grandfather's foresight. Henry had been investing in post-war suburban development, television manufacturers, and retail concepts decades before they became commonplace. More importantly, he'd been documenting his reasoning, leaving a trail of financial wisdom that read like a masterclass in long-term wealth building. "Listen to this, Lucy," Greg said, finding a particularly touching passage. Great-Grandpa Henry wrote, "I'm setting aside special accounts that our children won't access directly. Instead, these investments will grow for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I want young Gregory to have choices in life that I never had, and I want his children to know that they are loved across generations." Lucy looked up from the letter she'd been examining. "He was thinking about me before I was even born." "He was thinking about you before your daddy was even born. That's how much he loved our family." The motel room phone rang, startling them both. Greg hesitated. Very few people had this number, and most calls lately had brought bad news. But he answered on the 4th ring. "Greg, it's your father." William Morrison's voice carried an edge Greg had rarely heard before. His father was usually composed, diplomatic, the successful insurance broker who'd built his reputation on calm professionalism. Tonight, he sounded strained. "Hello, Dad. We need to talk. Robert called me about your visit to the bank today, and to Janet Mitchell's office." Greg felt his jaw tighten. News travels fast. "This is a small town, son. When someone claims $100 million inheritance, people notice." William's voice carried a mixture of concern and something else, fear, perhaps. "Your mother and I would like you to come to dinner tomorrow night. We need to discuss this situation before it goes any further." "What situation, Dad?" "You mean the situation where I discovered that my grandfather left me a fortune that the family has been hiding from me for 5 years. A long pause. "It's complicated, Greg. There are things you don't understand. Then explain them to me. Not over the phone. Come to dinner. Bring Lucy. We'll talk about everything." After hanging up, Greg sat quietly for several minutes, processing the conversation. His father's tone had been carefully controlled, but Greg sensed desperation underneath. For the first time in his life, he held power in their family dynamic, and his father knew it. "Was that Grandpa William?" Lucy asked. She'd met Greg's parents only a handful of times over the years, always at awkward family gatherings where conversation felt forced and artificial. "Yes, he wants us to come to dinner tomorrow." "Will there be enough food?" Lucy's question, innocent and practical, cut straight to Greg's heart. His 8-year-old daughter had learned to worry about basic necessities, while his parents lived in abundance, built partly on money that should have prevented Lucy's hunger. "There will be plenty of food, sweetheart, more than we could ever eat." That night, after Lucy had fallen asleep, Greg continued reading through the love letters and financial documents. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd not only built considerable wealth, but who'd also anticipated family conflicts over that wealth. In one letter from 1953, Henry had written to Eleanor about his concerns regarding their adult children. William and Robert are good men, but they lack vision beyond their immediate comfort. They see money as something to spend on status and pleasure, not as a tool for building lasting security. I fear that if they control the family fortune, it will be dissipated within a generation. Better to preserve it for Gregory's line, where I see more wisdom and character. Greg wondered how his grandfather had developed such insight into personalities that wouldn't fully manifest for decades. Had he seen something in the young William and Robert that predicted their eventual selfishness? Or had he simply understood human nature well enough to anticipate that sudden wealth might corrupt those who hadn't earned it? The most revealing letter was dated just months before Henry's death in 2020. His handwriting had become shakier, but his mind remained sharp. "Eleanor, my time grows short, and I worry about our family's future. The boys have grown comfortable with the modest distributions I've provided, but they don't understand the full scope of what I've built. I've hidden the primary inheritance where only Gregory will find it, and only when he truly needs it. If I'm right about his character, he'll use this gift to heal our family rather than destroy it. If I'm wrong, at least Lucy will have security for her entire life." Greg closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his grandfather's faith in him. Henry had bet the family's entire future on Greg's character, trusting that he would handle sudden wealth with wisdom and compassion. It was a responsibility that felt heavier than any amount of money. As he prepared for bed, Greg made a decision about tomorrow's dinner with his parents. He would go, he would listen to their explanations, and he would try to understand their perspective. But he would also make it clear that the days of family secrets and hidden fortunes were over. Lucy deserved better than a family divided by greed and deception. The love letters had shown him that his grandfather's greatest legacy wasn't the money itself, but the intention behind it to create security and opportunity for future generations. Greg was determined to honor that intention, even if it meant confronting the painful reality that some family members had lost sight of what truly mattered. Outside the motel window, the October night was crisp and clear, stars visible despite the glow from streetlights. Somewhere out there were properties and investments worth millions, all waiting for him to claim them. But more importantly, somewhere out there was a future where Lucy would never know hunger or homelessness, where she could grow up secure in the knowledge that she was loved across generations. That future was worth fighting for, no matter how difficult the battle might become. The next afternoon, Greg sat in Janet Mitchell's office, staring at stock certificates that looked like elaborate pieces of art from another era. The certificates, dated throughout the 1950s, represented shares in companies he recognized as household names today: IBM, General Electric, Coca-Cola, and dozens of others. What amazed him wasn't just their current value, but the foresight his grandfather had shown in selecting companies that would dominate American business for decades. These certificates alone are worth approximately $47 million, Janet explained, consulting her calculator and current market prices. Your grandfather bought shares in IBM when it was primarily making punch card machines. He invested in McDonald's when Ray Kroc was still convincing skeptics that fast food could be standardized. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to identify transformative companies before they transformed. Lucy sat quietly in the corner chair, working on a coloring book that Janet's secretary had provided. She'd grown accustomed to these meetings, where adults discussed numbers too large for anyone to truly comprehend. But Greg noticed she'd drawn several pictures of families living in big houses with lots of windows and colorful gardens. "What I don't understand," Greg said, "is why these certificates were in the safety deposit box instead of being managed by a brokerage firm. Wouldn't it have been easier to track their value and collect dividends electronically?" Janet smiled knowingly. "Your grandfather was old school, but he was also protecting these assets from family interference. Physical certificates can't be sold or transferred without the actual documents." By keeping them in a safety deposit box that only you could access, he ensured that no one else could liquidate these investments, even if they had legal authority over other parts of his estate. The implications sent a chill through Greg. His grandfather had anticipated that someone might try to access investments that weren't legally theirs. The physical certificates were a safeguard against theft by his own family members. "There's something else," Janet continued, pulling out a folder marked Dividend Accumulation. "These stocks have been paying dividends for decades. Since your grandfather never claimed them and no one else could access the certificates, the dividend payments have been accumulating in a separate account managed by the stock transfer agent." Greg stared at the statement showing decades of accumulated dividend payments, compounding year after year. How much? Approximately $12 million in unclaimed dividends, plus interest. The scope of his grandfather's financial engineering was breathtaking. Henry had created multiple layers of wealth accumulation, each designed to grow independently while remaining inaccessible to anyone without the proper documentation. It was like discovering that his grandfather had been a financial wizard disguised as a simple construction worker. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you something directly. In your professional opinion, did my Uncle Robert know about these stock certificates?" Janet hesitated, consulting her notes. Based on the questions he asked over the years and the specific documents he requested, I believe he suspected their existence but couldn't access them without the safety deposit box key. However, there's evidence that he may have attempted to claim some of the dividend payments. Evidence? 3 years ago, Robert submitted paperwork claiming to represent your grandfather's estate in dividend matters. The stock transfer agent rejected his claim because he couldn't provide the physical certificates or prove ownership. Robert was quite upset about the rejection. Greg felt the familiar surge of anger and betrayal. While he'd been selling Lucy's toys to buy groceries, his uncle had been actively trying to claim money that belonged to them. The pattern of deception ran deeper than mere family secrets. It bordered on attempted theft. "I think it's time for that dinner with my parents," Greg said grimly. 3 hours later, Greg and Lucy stood on the front porch of his parents' imposing colonial home on Hillcrest Drive. The house, which he'd always assumed represented his father's success in the insurance business, now looked different to him. The manicured lawn, expensive cars in the driveway, and recent renovations all took on new significance when viewed through the lens of hidden family wealth. Lucy pressed closer to his side as they waited for someone to answer the doorbell. "Daddy, this house is really big." "Yes, it is, sweetheart." Margaret Morrison opened the door with a smile that seemed forced around the edges. Greg's mother was an elegant woman in her 70s who prided herself on maintaining appearances, but tonight her usual composure seemed strained. "Gregory, Lucy, please come in. We're so glad you could join us." The dining room table was set with the good china and crystal glasses that Greg remembered from special occasions during his childhood. His father, William, sat at the head of the table, looking older than Greg remembered. Uncle Robert was also present, along with his wife Susan, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a family tribunal than a dinner invitation. "Lucy, sweetheart, would you like to watch cartoons in the living room while the adults talk?" Margaret suggested, her voice overly bright. "I'd rather stay with Daddy," Lucy said quietly, instinctively sensing the tension in the room. "Of course," Greg said, pulling out a chair for her. "Lucy stays with me." The meal proceeded with stilted conversation about weather and local news, everyone carefully avoiding the obvious reason for the gathering. It wasn't until dessert was served that William finally addressed the elephant in the room. "Greg, we need to discuss this situation with your grandfather's estate." "You mean the estate worth over $100 million that you've been hiding from me for 5 years, while my daughter and I struggled to survive?" The bluntness of Greg's statement hung in the air like a challenge. Uncle Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Margaret busied herself with clearing dessert plates. "It's not that simple," Robert said finally. Your grandfather's financial affairs were extremely complex. We were trying to protect you from getting overwhelmed while you dealt with Sarah's illness and Lucy's needs. Protect me? Greg's voice rose despite his effort to remain calm. Robert, I just learned that you tried to claim dividend payments that belonged to me. How exactly is attempted theft protecting me? Robert's face flushed red. That's not what happened. I was trying to consolidate accounts to make management easier, without my knowledge or consent. William intervened before the argument could escalate further. Boys, let's keep this civil. Greg, we understand you're upset, but there were good reasons for the decisions we made. Then explain them. Margaret returned to the table, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee. Gregory, your grandfather was worried about you. After Sarah died, you were so lost, so overwhelmed. He didn't want you to have the burden of managing such substantial wealth while you were grieving. So he arranged for the inheritance to be hidden until I discovered it myself. William nodded. He felt that when you were ready to handle it, you would somehow find your way to the truth. He had tremendous faith in your character. And in the meantime, you all benefited from managing assets that weren't yours. The accusation hung in the air, undenied and undeniable. Greg could see in their faces that his assessment was accurate. They had been living better lives thanks to money that should have secured his and Lucy's future. We never took anything that wasn't legitimately ours, Robert protested. The executor fees and management costs were appropriate. Executor fees on $100 million estate would be substantial, Greg observed coldly. Lucy, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. Daddy, why are they all so worried about the money? Great-Grandpa Henry wanted us to have it, right? Her innocent question cut through the complex rationalizations and justifications. Out of the mouths of babes came the simple truth that the adults had been dancing around for an hour. That's right, sweetheart, Greg said, pulling her closer. Great-Grandpa Henry wanted us to have it. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Gregory, we never wanted you to struggle. We just thought... You thought you knew better than my grandfather what was best for his own inheritance. You decided that your comfort was more important than our survival. The words were harsh but accurate. Greg felt no satisfaction in speaking them, only a deep sadness that it had come to this. The family dinner he'd hoped might lead to understanding and reconciliation was instead revealing the depth of their betrayal. As they prepared to leave, William made one final attempt at reconciliation. Greg, we're still family. We can work through this together. Yes, we are family, Greg replied, helping Lucy with her coat. And that makes what you've done even more painful. Family is supposed to protect each other, not exploit each other. Walking back to their car, Lucy slipped her hand into his. Daddy, are you sad about the money? No, sweetheart. I'm sad about the family, but the money will help us build something better. As they drove away from the house on Hillcrest Drive, Greg realized that claiming his inheritance would mean more than just gaining financial security. It would mean accepting that the family he'd known was built on deception, and that moving forward would require him to choose between wealth and relationships that had already been poisoned by greed. The stock certificates in the safety deposit box represented more than just financial assets. They represented his grandfather's faith that Greg would use wealth wisely and honorably. Tonight had shown him what that meant. It meant being the man his grandfather believed he could be, even when that meant standing alone against those who should have stood with him. 2 days after the disastrous family dinner, Greg was organizing documents in their new temporary apartment, a modest furnished rental he'd secured with part of his advance inheritance, when Lucy made a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. Daddy, there's another envelope in Great-Grandpa Henry's box, she called from the living room, where she'd been carefully examining each item. It was stuck to the bottom. Greg looked up from the financial statements he'd been reviewing. They'd gone through that box multiple times over the past week. Are you sure, sweetheart? Uh-huh. It says, Last Will and Testament True Copy on the outside. Greg's blood ran cold. He walked quickly to where Lucy sat cross-legged on the carpet, holding an envelope that had somehow escaped their notice. The aged manila envelope was sealed with wax and bore his grandfather's distinctive handwriting, to be opened only by Gregory Morrison or his direct descendants. With trembling hands, Greg broke the wax seal and withdrew a document that would shatter everything he believed about his family's betrayal. The will was dated just 6 months before his grandfather's death, much more recent than the will that had been probated through the court system. As Greg read the document, his understanding of the past 5 years crumbled. This wasn't just another version of his grandfather's will, it was a complete repudiation of the document that had given Robert control over the estate. My final will and testament. The document began in Henry's careful script, supersedes all previous versions, and must be filed with the probate court upon discovery by my beloved grandson, Gregory Morrison. I have learned disturbing information about my family's intentions regarding my estate, and I am taking steps to protect Gregory's inheritance from those who would claim it for themselves. Greg sat heavily on the couch, the implications washing over him. His grandfather hadn't just anticipated family greed, he'd discovered it while still alive and had taken steps to counter it. The will continued. I have become aware that my son William and my son-in-law Robert have been planning to contest any substantial inheritance left to Gregory, claiming that he is financially irresponsible due to his wife's medical expenses. They have consulted attorneys about breaking any will that favors Gregory over themselves, believing that they can present themselves as more suitable guardians of the family wealth. Greg felt sick. While he'd been caring for his dying wife, his family had been plotting to steal his inheritance. But there was more. Furthermore, I have discovered that Robert has been embezzling from my business accounts for the past 3 years, believing that I am too old and inattentive to notice. The total amount stolen exceeds 2.3 million. Rather than confront this theft directly, I have chosen to use this knowledge to protect Gregory's future. Lucy looked up at her father's pale face. Daddy, what does the paper say? It says that great-grandpa Henry was even smarter than we thought, and that some people in our family have been very dishonest. The will went on to detail a sophisticated plan that revealed Henry Morrison to be far more cunning than anyone had realized. He had deliberately created a false will, the one that had been probated, that gave Robert control over a much smaller estate, while hiding the bulk of his wealth in accounts and investments that only the true will could unlock. The will that Robert has filed with the court disposes of approximately 8 million in assets, a substantial sum that should satisfy their greed while protecting the true inheritance of over 120 million for Gregory. Only this document, hidden where Robert cannot find it, reveals the location and access information for my primary holdings. Greg realized that his grandfather had essentially created a decoy estate, allowing his family to steal what they thought was everything while protecting what really mattered. It was a masterpiece of misdirection that had taken 5 years to fully reveal itself. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. I must also inform Gregory that his eviction was not a coincidence. Through my business contacts, I have learned that Robert approached Gregory's landlord, Mr. Berkowitz, with an offer to purchase his rental properties at above-market prices. The condition of this sale was that Gregory Morrison specifically be evicted before the transaction could proceed. Robert's plan was to force Gregory into financial desperation, making him more likely to accept a small settlement from the estate rather than fighting for his full inheritance. The room spun around Greg. His eviction, the traumatic event that had left him and Lucy homeless, had been orchestrated by his own uncle. Robert hadn't just stolen from his grandfather, he'd actively worked to destroy Greg's life, to cover up his theft. The property purchases went through last month, the will continued, which means that Gregory's eviction was the direct result of Robert's manipulation. I have documented evidence of these transactions, which are attached to this will and should be used to pursue both criminal charges and civil remedies. Greg looked at the attachments his grandfather had included photocopies of contracts, bank statements, and correspondence that painted a picture of calculated cruelty. Robert had spent months planning Greg's downfall, using stolen money to purchase the properties that would make him homeless. Lucy abandoned her coloring and climbed onto the couch beside her father, sensing his distress. "Daddy, are you crying?" Greg wiped his eyes, not realizing that tears had begun to fall. "I'm just sad about some things our family did to us." "Sweetheart, but Great-Grandpa Henry stopped them, right? That's why he hid the real will?" Out of the mouths of babes again. Lucy had grasped the essential truth. Their grandfather had anticipated the betrayal and had protected them from it, even reaching from beyond the grave to ensure justice. The final section of the will provided specific instructions for Greg's next steps. Gregory must file this will with the probate court immediately upon discovery. The previous will should be declared fraudulent, and Robert should be removed as executor. More importantly, the evidence of embezzlement and the orchestrated eviction should be turned over to law enforcement. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It is simply justice that arrives when it is most needed. There was also a personal message that brought fresh tears to Greg's eyes. "Gregory, if you are reading this, it means that you have endured the hardships I could not prevent, but could only prepare you to overcome. Your suffering was not meaningless. It has revealed who your true friends are and has prepared you to handle wealth with the wisdom that only comes from understanding poverty. Use this inheritance not just to secure your own future, but to help others who face the struggles you have endured. Make me proud, not just as your grandfather, but as a man who believes in justice and family." As Greg finished reading, he realized that everything he'd experienced over the past week, from the discovery of the key to the painful family dinner, had been orchestrated by his grandfather's posthumous plan. Henry had known that Robert would reveal his true nature when threatened with losing control of the estate, and he'd provided Greg with the tools to seek justice. But claiming justice would mean more than just recovering stolen money. It would mean sending his uncle to prison and destroying what remained of their family relationships. The inheritance came with a choice: pursue the truth and accept the consequences, or allow the injustice to stand for the sake of family peace. Looking at Lucy, who was quietly drawing a picture of a man with a halo watching over a father and daughter, Greg knew what his decision would be. His grandfather had endured months of knowing about his family's betrayal in order to protect Lucy's future. The least Greg could do was honor that sacrifice by ensuring that justice was served. The secret will wasn't just a legal document, it was a final gift from a man who'd loved his family enough to see them clearly, even when that clarity revealed uncomfortable truths. Henry Morrison had given Greg not just wealth, but the knowledge and tools necessary to protect that wealth from those who would abuse it. Now it was Greg's turn to prove worthy of his grandfather's faith by doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The legal power of attorney document dated 1963 lay on Janet Mitchell's desk like a smoking gun, its implications reverberating through the conference room where Greg, Janet, and District Attorney Sarah Chen had been meeting for the past 2 hours. The document revealed that Henry Morrison had anticipated family treachery decades before it occurred, and had taken extraordinary steps to protect his grandson's inheritance. "This changes everything," D.A. Chen said, adjusting her reading glasses as she examined the meticulously crafted legal document. "Your grandfather essentially created a parallel legal structure that bypassed your family's control entirely. This power of attorney gave his attorney Mitchell's predecessor authority to act on behalf of your inheritance, independently of any family oversight." Janet nodded grimly. "My father handled this account until his retirement in 2015, then passed it to me with strict instructions. We've been waiting for you to discover the truth for 5 years, maintaining these secret accounts and investments exactly as your grandfather specified." Greg felt overwhelmed by the revelation that an entire legal team had been working on his behalf without his knowledge following instructions from a man who died years ago. So, the attorney who handled my grandfather's public estate was following a completely different set of instructions, Janet confirmed. Robert thought he was controlling your grandfather's entire estate, but he was actually managing less than 10% of the true holdings. The bulk of everything was being preserved through this separate legal structure. Lucy sat quietly in the corner of the conference room, working on homework that her new school had assigned. Despite the adult conversation happening around her, she seemed more interested in her math problems than in the legal complexities that would determine their future. Greg envied her ability to focus on simple, concrete problems with clear solutions. DHN spread out the evidence documents that Henry's true will had provided. The embezzlement case against Robert is airtight. We have bank records, forged signatures, and a pattern of theft spanning 3 years. But what makes this particularly egregious is the orchestrated eviction. Using stolen money to manipulate someone into homelessness crosses the line from white-collar crime into something much more personal and cruel. "What kind of charges are we looking at?" Greg asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. For Robert, we're talking about multiple felony counts: embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and potentially racketeering. If we can prove that others in your family were aware of the scheme. Your father's involvement is less clear, but there's evidence he knew about the property purchases that led to your eviction. Greg closed his eyes, trying to process the reality that his family members might face serious prison time. 6 months ago, his biggest worry had been paying rent. Now he was learning that his relatives were career criminals who'd targeted their own family. "There's something else we need to discuss," Janet said carefully. "The scope of your actual inheritance is larger than we initially calculated. Your grandfather's investments have been managed so conservatively and successfully that the current value exceeds $180 million. The number hit Greg like a physical blow. $180 million. More money than most people could imagine, let alone spend in a lifetime. It was wealth that would transform not just his and Lucy's lives, but potentially the lives of everyone they touched. "Daddy, that's an even bigger number than before," Lucy observed without looking up from her homework. "Yes, it is, sweetheart." DHN leaned forward, her expression serious. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to understand what pursuing these charges means. This will become a very public case. Wealthy family members stealing from each other always attracts media attention. Your uncle, and possibly your father, will face significant prison sentences. There will be no going back to family relationships as they were. And if I don't pursue charges, then Robert keeps the money he stole, your family continues to benefit from their deception, and you set a precedent that theft is acceptable as long as it's kept within the family." Greg looked at Lucy, still focused on her math homework, with the intense concentration of a child who believed that hard work would always lead to correct answers. She represented everything pure and innocent in his life, everything he needed to protect and preserve. His grandfather had structured this entire plan around ensuring her future security and happiness. "I need to see the property where my grandfather wanted us to live," Greg said suddenly. "Janet, you mentioned that there was a house." "Yes, it's been maintained by a property management company for 5 years, kept ready for your arrival. Your grandfather was very specific that you should see it before making any final decisions about the estate." An hour later, they drove through the gates of what Greg had assumed was an exclusive country club. The winding driveway led through professionally landscaped grounds to a stunning colonial mansion that took his breath away. The house was elegant but not ostentatious, with warm brick facade, white columns, and gardens that spoke of careful planning and generous maintenance. "Great-grandpa Henry lived here?" Lucy asked in wonder as they got out of the car. "No, sweetheart. He bought this house for us. He wanted it to be our home when we were ready." The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Every room had been decorated with tasteful furniture and filled with thoughtful touches that spoke of a grandfather's love for his family. Lucy's bedroom was painted in soft pastels, with built-in bookshelves and a window seat overlooking the gardens. Greg's office contained a mahogany desk and leather-bound books, but also family photographs and a letter addressed to him. "My dear Gregory," the letter began, "if you are reading this in the house I prepared for your family, it means that you have successfully navigated the challenges I could not spare you from experiencing. This house is not a reward for your suffering, but a foundation for your future happiness. Every room was designed with love for you and Lucy, and I hope it will be filled with the laughter and joy that every family deserves." Lucy ran from room to room, marveling at spaces that seemed designed specifically for her happiness. The playroom contained toys and games, the kitchen had been stocked with child-friendly snacks, and the backyard featured a swing set and sandbox that would have been perfect for a child her age. "Your grandfather thought of everything," Janet observed, watching Lucy's delight. "He even established accounts for household maintenance, property taxes, and Lucy's future education. This house comes with enough money to maintain it properly for the rest of your lives." Standing in the master bedroom that overlooked the gardens where Lucy was now exploring, Greg felt the full weight of his grandfather's love and planning. Henry Morrison had spent years preparing for this moment, anticipating Greg's needs and Lucy's happiness with remarkable foresight. But he'd also prepared for the battle that claiming this inheritance would require. "Janet, what would my grandfather have wanted me to do about Robert and the theft?" She was quiet for a long moment, watching Lucy chase butterflies in the garden below. "Your grandfather was a man who believed in justice, but he also understood the cost of pursuing it. He left you all the tools you need to seek legal remedies, but he also gave you enough wealth that you could choose forgiveness instead." "What does that mean?" "It means the choice is yours. You can pursue criminal charges and civil recovery, or you can simply claim your inheritance and walk away from family members who've proven themselves untrustworthy. You're wealthy enough now that recovering the stolen money won't impact your security." Greg understood. His grandfather had given him not just wealth, but the power to choose justice or mercy. It was a test of character, more profound than any financial challenge. That evening, as they shared their first dinner in the mansion's elegant dining room, Lucy made an observation that crystallized Greg's thinking. "Daddy, this house is really big for just 2 people." "It is. What do you think we should do about that?" "Maybe we could share it with people who need help, like we needed help." Greg smiled at his daughter's wisdom. She'd grasped something important about wealth and responsibility that many people never understood. Money wasn't just about personal comfort, it was about the capacity to help others and make positive change in the world. As he tucked Lucy into her new bedroom that night, Greg realized that his decision about pursuing charges against Robert wasn't really about money or justice. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be and what kind of world he wanted to help create for his daughter. His grandfather had given him the tools for justice and the resources for mercy. Tomorrow, he would choose which path to take, knowing that either choice would define not just his future, but Lucy's understanding of how power should be used when it's placed in good hands. The courtroom was packed with family members, townspeople, and reporters who had caught wind of what the local newspaper was calling the Morrison inheritance scandal. Greg sat at the plaintiff's table with Janet Mitchell, holding his grandfather's personal journal from 1964, the final artifact that would determine his family's fate. The journal contained entries that painted a heartbreaking picture of an elderly man's growing awareness of his family's greed and his desperate attempts to protect his grandson's future. Greg had spent the previous night reading every entry, watching his grandfather's hope slowly transform into bitter disappointment as he uncovered the depth of his family's betrayal. October 15th, 1964. One entry read in Henry's increasingly shaky handwriting, "I caught Robert going through my business files again today. When I confronted him, he claimed he was helping organize my affairs, but I know he was looking for information about my investment accounts. I fear my own son-in-law sees me as nothing more than a source of inheritance to be claimed as quickly as possible." Lucy sat in the gallery behind Greg, holding the hand of Sarah Chen, the kind district attorney who had offered to watch her during the proceedings. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Lucy had brought along a drawing she'd made of her great-grandfather, a smiling figure surrounded by hearts, and the words, "Thank you for loving us." Judge Patricia Hartwell called the court to order, her expression grave as she surveyed the packed courtroom. "We're here today to resolve several related matters involving the estate of Henry Morrison, allegations of fraud and embezzlement, and the validity of conflicting wills. Mr. Morrison, you may proceed with your opening statement." Greg stood, feeling the weight of his grandfather's journal in his hands and the responsibility of 5 years of hidden truth on his shoulders. "Your Honor, this case is about more than money. It's about an elderly man's love for his family and his heartbreak when that family chose greed over loyalty." He opened the journal to a passage he'd marked the night before. "My grandfather wrote, 'I gave my children everything I could while I lived, but it was never enough. They look at me now and see only what they might inherit, not the man who sacrificed everything to build their futures. If this is what wealth does to families, then perhaps Gregory is better off never knowing how much I truly built for him.'" A murmur ran through the courtroom. In the gallery, Greg could see his parents and Uncle Robert sitting with their attorney, their faces pale as they realized the extent of what Henry had documented. "But my grandfather did leave that wealth for me and my daughter," Greg continued, "along with detailed evidence of the theft and manipulation that followed his death. This journal contains 5 years of observations about family members who saw his generosity as weakness and his love as an opportunity for exploitation." Janet stood and presented the court with copies of the journal entries, bank records, property transfer documents, and the secret will that revealed the true scope of Henry's estate. Each piece of evidence was damning, building a case that went beyond simple greed into calculated cruelty. The defendant, Robert Morrison, didn't just steal money from the estate, Janet explained to the court. He used that stolen money to purchase the rental properties where Mr. Gregory Morrison was living, specifically to force an eviction that would leave his nephew and great-niece homeless. This wasn't theft. It was a coordinated attack on a grieving family's stability. Robert's attorney, a nervous man in an expensive suit, attempted to argue that his client had been trying to consolidate family assets for more efficient management, but the evidence was overwhelming. The journal entries showed that Henry had been aware of Robert's theft and had deliberately created a paper trail to protect Greg's inheritance. December 3rd, 1964. Greg read from another journal entry. "Robert asked me again today about updating my will. He suggested that Gregory might not be emotionally stable enough to handle substantial wealth, given his wife's illness. I told him that Gregory's compassion and dedication to his family are exactly the qualities that make him worthy of inheritance. Robert's suggestion that grief makes a man weak shows how little he understands about love and character." The most powerful moment came when D.A. Chen presented evidence of the property scheme that had led to Greg and Lucy's eviction. Bank records showed Robert using embezzled funds to purchase buildings from Mr. Berkowitz, with contracts specifically requiring the eviction of Gregory Morrison and any dependents before the sale could be completed. "This wasn't coincidence," D.A. Chen told the court. "This was a deliberate attempt to force Mr. Morrison into financial desperation, making him more likely to accept a small settlement rather than investigating his true inheritance." Lucy shifted in her seat, not fully understanding the legal proceedings, but sensing the emotion in her father's voice. During a brief recess, she approached the defense table, where Uncle Robert sat with his head in his hands. "Uncle Robert," she said in her clear, innocent voice. "Why did you make us have no house?" The question, delivered without malice or anger, seemed to hit Robert harder than any legal argument. He looked up at his 8-year-old great-niece, tears streaming down his face, unable to provide an answer that would make sense to a child who still believed that family members were supposed to take care of each other. When court resumed, Judge Hartwell addressed Robert directly. "Mr. Morrison, you stand accused of embezzling over $2 million from your father-in-law's estate and using those funds to deliberately harm your nephew's family. How do you plead?" Robert stood slowly, looking older than his 67 years. For a moment, Greg thought he might fight the charges, but then Robert's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Guilty, Your Honor, to all charges." The admission sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Robert's attorney looked stunned, having prepared for a lengthy trial rather than a sudden confession. Greg felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Justice was being served, but at the cost of destroying what remained of their family. "Furthermore," Robert continued, his voice barely audible, "I want to apologize to my nephew Gregory and my great-niece Lucy. What I did was unforgivable. I let greed poison my judgment and harm innocent people who deserved my protection, not my cruelty." Judge Hartwell scheduled sentencing for the following week, but the civil matter of the estate could be resolved immediately. The fraudulent will was declared invalid, the secret will was accepted as Henry's true final testament, and Greg was officially recognized as the sole heir to an estate worth over $180 million. As they left the courthouse, Greg carried both his grandfather's journal and the legal documents that secured Lucy's future. The money would solve every practical problem they faced, but the emotional cost of claiming it would take much longer to process. Outside, reporters shouted questions about his plans for the inheritance and his feelings about his uncle's confession. Greg ignored them all, focusing instead on Lucy, who was skipping ahead toward their car, seemingly unaffected by the drama that had just unfolded. "Daddy," she called back to him, "can we go home now? I want to show Great-Grandpa Henry's picture our new house." Greg smiled, realizing that Lucy had already grasped the most important truth of the day. They finally had a home, not just a house, but the security and stability that came from knowing they were loved across generations. His grandfather's journal had documented years of family dysfunction, but it had also preserved a record of unwavering love for Greg and Lucy. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Henry Morrison's faith in his grandson had been vindicated. Greg had handled sudden wealth with dignity, pursued truth despite family pressure, and protected his daughter's future while maintaining his own integrity. The inheritance was finally, officially, and completely theirs. The brass keys to grandfather's hidden home felt warm in Greg's palm as he and Lucy stood before the most beautiful house either of them had ever seen. The Victorian mansion on Oakwood Boulevard had been maintained in perfect condition for 5 years, waiting for this moment when Henry Morrison's true vision for his family's future would finally be revealed. "This is really ours, Daddy?" Lucy whispered, her small hand reaching for the ornate doorknob that matched the key her great-grandfather had hidden for them to find. "It really is, sweetheart." The front door opened to reveal a foyer that looked like something from a fairy tale: polished hardwood floors, a sweeping staircase with carved banisters, and crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns on the walls. But what made Greg's throat tighten with emotion were the personal touches. Framed photographs of him and Lucy throughout the years, furniture that perfectly matched their tastes, and fresh flowers in every room that suggested someone had been preparing for their arrival. "Mr. Morrison?" A kind-faced woman in her 60s appeared from the kitchen, wearing an apron and carrying a plate of chocolate chip cookies that were still warm from the oven. "I'm Mrs. Patterson. I've been taking care of this house for your grandfather, waiting for you and Lucy to come home." Greg stared at her in amazement. "You've been maintaining this house for 5 years? Your grandfather hired me in 2019, just before he passed. He told me that someday his grandson and great-granddaughter would need a real home, and when that day came, everything should be perfect for them. She smiled at Lucy, who was staring at the cookies with obvious hunger. He described you both so well that I feel like I already know you. As they toured the house, Mrs. Patterson explained Henry's incredible attention to detail. Lucy's bedroom was painted in her favorite shade of purple, with a canopy bed and a reading nook filled with books chosen specifically for her age and interests. Greg's master suite included a sitting area with his favorite type of leather chair and a desk positioned to catch the morning light details that his grandfather couldn't have known except through careful observation during their rare visits. "How did he know so much about our preferences?" Greg asked, running his hand along the smooth surface of a mahogany bookshelf. "He visited your old house many times," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "not to interfere but to watch and learn. He wanted to understand what made you both happy so he could recreate that happiness here. He told me that love requires attention to small details." In the kitchen, Lucy discovered a cookie jar shaped like a teddy bear, exactly like one she'd lost when they were evicted. The refrigerator was stocked with her favorite foods, and the pantry contained ingredients for the simple meals that Greg knew how to cook well. Every detail spoke of a grandfather's love expressed through careful preparation. "There's something else, Mrs. Patterson said, leading them to the living room where a large envelope rested on the mantelpiece. "He left specific instructions that you should read this after you'd seen the house." Greg opened the envelope with trembling hands, revealing one final letter from his grandfather, not a legal document this time, but a personal message from grandfather to grandson. "My dearest Gregory and Lucy," the letter began, "if you are reading this in the house I prepared for you, then my plan has succeeded beyond my greatest hopes. You have discovered not just my financial legacy, but proof of my love for you both. This house is not a monument to wealth. It is a foundation for happiness." Greg's voice broke as he continued reading aloud. "I know that claiming this inheritance has cost you relationships with other family members. I am sorry for that burden, but I am not sorry for protecting what belongs to you. Some people mistake kindness for weakness and generosity for opportunity. You are not those people." Lucy sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, listening intently as her father read their great-grandfather's final words. "Gregory, I chose you as my primary heir, not because you were perfect, but because you understand that wealth is responsibility, not privilege. I watched you sacrifice everything for Sarah's medical care, work multiple jobs to provide for Lucy, and maintain your dignity even when facing homelessness. These experiences have prepared you to use money wisely." The letter continued with specific guidance about managing the inheritance, including the establishment of charitable foundations and educational trusts that would benefit the community for generations. Henry had even outlined potential projects: a scholarship fund for families dealing with medical crises, affordable housing initiatives, and support programs for single parents. "But remember," the letter concluded, "that your greatest treasure is not money, it is Lucy. Raise her to understand that privilege comes with responsibility, that wealth is a tool for good, and that family loyalty must be earned through love and respect, not demanded through blood relations." As Greg finished reading, Mrs. Patterson quietly withdrew to give them privacy. Father and daughter sat together in their new living room, surrounded by evidence of a grandfather's love that had transcended death to provide for their future. "Daddy, can we go see great-grandpa Henry and tell him thank you?" Lucy asked. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart." Later that afternoon, they drove to Hillcrest Cemetery, where Henry Morrison rested beneath a simple granite headstone. Lucy had insisted on bringing flowers from their new garden, white roses that Miss Patterson had said were his favorites. As they knelt beside the grave, Greg felt a profound sense of completion. The journey from homelessness to wealth had been painful but transformative, teaching him lessons about family, responsibility, and the true meaning of inheritance that he could never have learned any other way. "Great-grandpa Henry," Lucy said softly, placing the roses on the grave. "We found your house and it's beautiful. Thank you for taking care of us, even from heaven." Greg placed his hand on the granite marker, feeling the warmth of autumn sunlight and the peace that comes from understanding one's place in the world. "Thank you, Grandpa. For the money, yes, but mostly for believing in us. We won't let you down." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree that shaded Henry's grave, and for a moment, Greg could almost feel his grandfather's presence, not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as the living influence of love that continues to shape lives long after the lover has departed. Standing to leave, Greg realized that their story was just beginning. The inheritance had ended their immediate struggles, but it had also given them the resources and responsibility to help others facing similar challenges. They had become custodians of Henry Morrison's vision for a world where families protected each other and wealth served love rather than destroying it. As they walked back to their car, Lucy slipped her hand into his. "Daddy, I think Great-Grandpa Henry is happy that we're together." "I think so too, sweetheart. I think so too." The keys to their new home, their real home, jingled softly in Greg's pocket as they drove away from the cemetery. Behind them, white roses bloomed on the grave of a man whose love had reached across time to transform his family's future. Ahead of them lay the responsibility and joy of using that gift wisely, guided by the wisdom of a grandfather who had understood that the greatest inheritance is not money, but the example of how to live with purpose and love. 6 months later, the Morrison Family Foundation occupied a restored building on Main Street, its mission statement etched in brass beside the front entrance. To provide security and opportunity for families facing unexpected hardship, in honor of Henry Morrison's belief that love requires action. Inside, Greg Morrison worked at a desk that had once belonged to his grandfather, surrounded by thank you letters from families who had received assistance during their darkest hours. Lucy, now 9 years old and thriving in her new school, burst through the office door with the enthusiasm that had become her trademark since their lives had stabilized. She carried a painting she'd created in art class, a family portrait that included not just her and Greg, but ghostly figures of her mother and great-grandfather watching over them with expressions of pride and love. "Daddy, look what I made. Mrs. Henderson helped me with the painting technique." Lucy held up her artwork, beaming with the confidence of a child who had learned that she was loved across generations. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. I think we should hang it in the main lobby so everyone can see how talented you are." Greg studied the painting, marveling at how his daughter had captured something profound about their family's story. The way love persisted beyond death and transformed lives across time. The foundation had distributed over $15 million in its first 6 months, helping families avoid foreclosure, covering medical expenses that insurance wouldn't pay, and providing educational scholarships for children whose parents were struggling financially. Every recipient was required to meet with Greg personally, not because he didn't trust his staff, but because he wanted to understand each family's story and learn from their experiences. "Mr. Morrison?" Sarah Chen appeared in the doorway, no longer serving as district attorney but now as the foundation's executive director. She had left her position in law enforcement after realizing that preventing financial crises could be more effective than prosecuting the crimes that often resulted from desperation. "The Williams family is here for their follow-up appointment." Greg smiled, remembering the young couple who had faced bankruptcy when their infant son required emergency surgery. The foundation had covered their medical bills and helped them restructure their finances, but more importantly, it had given them hope during the darkest period of their lives. "Send them in. Lucy, would you like to hear how baby Thomas is doing?" The Williams family, David, Maria, and 8-month-old Thomas, entered the office with expressions of gratitude that reminded Greg why his grandfather's inheritance had been about much more than personal wealth. Baby Thomas was healthy and growing, David had found stable employment, and Maria was completing nursing school with the foundation's educational support. Mr. Morrison, we can never thank you enough, Maria said, holding her son with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who had almost lost everything. 6 months ago, we thought we were going to lose our home and our hope. Now Thomas is healthy, and we're building the future we always dreamed of. The thanks belong to my grandfather, Greg replied, gesturing to Henry's portrait on the wall. I'm just carrying out his vision for how wealth should serve families. After the Williams family left, Greg and Lucy walked home through the tree-lined streets of their neighborhood. The Victorian mansion had become not just their residence, but a gathering place for extended family of choice. Mrs. Patterson, who had become like a grandmother to Lucy, Sarah Chen, who joined them for dinner twice a week, and the various families who had been helped by the foundation and remained part of their ever-expanding circle of love. The relationship with Greg's blood relatives remained complicated but slowly healing. His parents had begun attending family counseling, working to understand how their financial anxieties had led them to make decisions that hurt their own family. Uncle Robert was serving a reduced sentence in minimum security prison, but had written heartfelt letters of apology that suggested genuine remorse for his actions. "Daddy, do you think Great-Grandpa Henry knew we would help other families?" Lucy asked as they climbed the front steps of their home. "I think he hoped we would. That's why he left us so much money, not so we could buy lots of expensive things, but so we could share with people who need help." That evening, as had become their tradition, Greg and Lucy sat in the living room, reading together before bedtime. Tonight's book was a biography of Andrew Carnegie that Greg hoped would help Lucy understand the responsibility that came with inherited wealth. But more importantly, it was time they spent together, father and daughter, building the strong relationship that would guide Lucy as she grew up with advantages her father had never known. "Daddy, when I grow up, will I help families too?" "Only if you want to, sweetheart. The foundation will be yours someday, but you'll get to decide how to use it. Great-Grandpa Henry trusted our family to make good choices, and I trust you to continue that tradition. I want to help kids who don't have enough food, like we didn't have enough food that day in the park." Greg's throat tightened with emotion. At 9 years old, Lucy was already developing the empathy and social consciousness that would make her worthy of Henry Morrison's faith in their family line. As he tucked Lucy into her canopy bed, the one that had been waiting for her in their grandfather's house, Greg reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, they had been homeless and desperate, sitting on a park bench with nothing but a cardboard box of old belongings. Tonight, they were secure in a beautiful home, surrounded by love, and empowered to help others avoid the struggles they had endured. The new family portrait that Lucy had painted hung on the wall above her bed, its ghostly figures of Henry and Sarah seeming to watch over her with expressions of eternal love. Greg kissed his daughter's forehead and whispered the prayer that had become their nightly ritual. "Thank you for the family that loves us, for the home that shelters us, and for the chance to help others find their way to safety." Walking to his own bedroom, Greg paused at the window that overlooked the gardens where Lucy played each afternoon. The grounds were beautifully maintained, but they were also functional vegetable gardens that provided fresh food for both their family and the community food bank. Play areas where children from the families they helped could enjoy safe recreation, and quiet spaces where parents could find peace during difficult times. On his nightstand lay the latest letter from Henry's attorney, confirming that the foundation's work was exceeding all expectations and that the inheritance would continue growing for generations to come. But more meaningful were the photographs that surrounded the legal documents, pictures of families who had been helped, children who were thriving, and parents who had found hope again. Greg pulled out the original ornate key that had started their journey, now kept as a reminder of how the smallest discoveries could change everything. He thought about the grandfather he had barely known in life, but who had become his greatest teacher in death, showing him that true wealth was measured not in possessions, but in the ability to transform lives through love and generosity. Outside his window, the October moon cast silver light on the gardens, where Lucy would wake tomorrow and continue building the happy childhood that Henry Morrison had planned for her. Inside the house, 3 generations of family love continued their influence. Henry through his financial legacy, Sarah through the values she had instilled in Greg, and Greg through the security and guidance he was providing for Lucy. The inheritance had been claimed, the family secrets had been revealed, and justice had been served. But more importantly, a new chapter in the Morrison family story was being written, one defined not by greed and betrayal, but by love, responsibility, and the understanding that true wealth comes from using whatever resources we have to make the world a little better for those who need help. As Greg drifted off to sleep in the home his grandfather had prepared for them, he smiled at the thought that somewhere, somehow, Henry Morrison was proud of the man his grandson had become and the future his great-granddaughter would inherit. The first 100 million secret had been revealed, but its greatest value wasn't in the money itself. It was in the proof that love, when expressed through thoughtful action, could reach across time to transform lives and heal the wounds that life inevitably inflicted on every family. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to help others, new challenges to overcome, and new ways to honor the grandfather whose faith in them had never wavered. But tonight, father and daughter slept peacefully in their beautiful home, surrounded by love and secure in the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves, a legacy of generosity that would continue blessing families for generations to come.